Chen adjusted his glasses and stared dubiously at the limestone entrance to Red Rock Canyon Cave. The yawning mouth of darkness seemed to mock his city sensibilities, a stark contrast to the sandstone cliffs gleaming orange in the late morning sun. "Come on, Morgan, you're holding up the group." Jessica, his girlfriend of 8 months, tugged at his sleeve. Her enthusiasm for this adventure vacation had been relentless since they'd left Philadelphia. "I'm just making sure my headlamp is working," he lied, tapping the device strapped to his forehead. In truth, the thought of squeezing through underground passages made his throat constrict. As a software developer who spent his days in climate-controlled comfort, this was well outside his comfort zone. Their guide, a weathered man named Dax with sun-creased skin and calloused hands, gathered the 12 tourists at the entrance. "Folks, remember what I said during orientation. Stay together, watch your step, and don't touch the formations. Some of these stalactites and stalagmites have been growing for thousands of years." Morgan scanned the group. Jessica, an older couple with matching hiking boots, a family of 4 with teenagers, 2 college-aged guys who'd mentioned they were geology students, and a middle-aged couple who'd been photographing everything since they'd arrived. "Any chance of rain today?" asked the father from the family of 4, glancing at gathering clouds in the distance. Dax shrugged. "Forecast said only 20% chance, and these summer storms usually blow over quick. We'll be fine underground anyway." As they filed into the cave entrance, Morgan felt the temperature drop immediately. The air smelled of damp earth and minerals. His headlamp cut a weak path through the darkness, and he kept close behind Jessica. "Pretty incredible, right?" she whispered, her face illuminated with childlike wonder as she gazed at the glistening formations. Morgan nodded, trying to appreciate the alien beauty while suppressing his unease. The weight of stone above pressed down on his consciousness. They descended deeper, following Dax through increasingly narrow passages. Water dripped somewhere in the darkness, a rhythmic plink that echoed through the chambers. 40 minutes into the tour, they reached a large cavern Dax called the Cathedral. Massive columns stretched from floor to ceiling, and a small underground stream trickled along one side. "This stream can rise during heavy rains," Dax explained, "but it hasn't flooded significantly in decades. The water finds other paths through the mountain." As if on cue, a distant rumble penetrated the stone around them. Morgan glanced nervously at the ceiling. "Just a little thunder," Dax said reassuringly. "Let's continue to the crystal room. It's the highlight of the tour." They squeezed through a narrow passage called the Squeeze that had Morgan breathing rapidly, his chest tight with anxiety. Jessica reached back and squeezed his hand. "You're doing great," she whispered. The crystal room lived up to its name. Delicate crystalline formations sparkled in their headlamps like a treasury of jewels. Under different circumstances, Morgan might have appreciated their beauty more. But another rumble, louder this time, sent vibrations through the stone. Dax's radio crackled. He stepped away, speaking in low tones. When he returned, his expression had changed. "Folks, there's an unexpected weather system moving in. We're going to head back earlier than planned." "Is everything okay?" asked one of the geology students. "Just a precaution," Dax said, but Morgan caught the tension in his voice. "Let's move efficiently." They retraced their steps, moving faster now. When they reached the cathedral again, Morgan noticed the stream had already widened, the water moving more rapidly. Then came a sound that turned Morgan's blood to ice, a distant roar growing louder by the second. Dax's face paled in the headlamp light. "Run! To higher ground! Now!" Before Morgan could process the command, a wall of brown water surged into the cathedral from a passage they hadn't noticed before. The force of it knocked several people off their feet immediately. Screams echoed off the walls as the flood swept through the chamber. Morgan felt Jessica's hand torn from his as the water hit them. He was submerged instantly, tumbling in the current, striking rock, unable to tell up from down. His lungs burned as he fought against the pull, desperate for air. When he finally broke the surface, gasping and coughing, The world had transformed into chaos. Headlamps bobbed in the churning water like desperate fireflies. Screams competed with the roar of the flood. "Jessica!" he screamed, but his voice was swallowed by the tumult. The current slammed him against a rock formation. Pain exploded in his shoulder, but the impact gave him something to cling to. He pulled himself onto a ledge, water streaming from his clothes, his headlamp miraculously still functioning. Around him, the cave had become a raging underground river, and somewhere in that darkness were Jessica and the others, fighting for their lives. The first hour after the flood hit passed in a blur of shouting and desperate searching. Morgan had managed to pull himself higher onto the rock shelf, which rose about 6 feet above the now raging underground river. His clothes clung to him, cold and heavy, and his shoulder throbbed where he'd struck the rock. His headlamp cut weakly through the darkness, revealing the transformed cathedral chamber. The once tranquil space now echoed with the constant roar of rushing water. Morgan called Jessica's name until his voice grew hoarse, but heard nothing in response except the water's relentless thunder. "Hello? Is anyone there?" He tried again, sweeping his light across the chamber. A faint voice responded from somewhere to his left. "Over here!" Morgan directed his beam toward the sound and spotted one of the geology students, Ryan or Brian, he couldn't remember which, clinging to a column about 20 feet away. "Are you hurt?" Morgan called. "I think my leg's broken," came the pained reply. "I can't move." Morgan surveyed the distance between them. The water rushed through the space, but several rock formations created a potential path. His heart hammered in his chest. He'd never been athletic, had avoided the climbing wall at his company retreats, and now someone's life might depend on his ability to traverse this treacherous gap. "Hang on," he shouted. "I'm coming over." Morgan tested his weight on the first formation, a slick limestone shelf. His shoes slipped immediately, and he fell to his hands and knees, scraping his palms. The shelf held, though, and he crawled forward, fighting panic with each inch gained. The journey took nearly 20 minutes, with Morgan moving from one precarious handhold to another. When he finally reached the geology student, he found a young man with a pale face, slick with sweat, his right leg bent at an unnatural angle. "Brian," the young man said through gritted teeth, extending his hand. "Thanks for coming over." "Morgan," he replied, carefully examining the injury without touching it. "That's definitely broken. We need to stabilize it." Brian nodded. "I've got a rain jacket in my pack. We could use the sleeves as ties and find something for a splint." Morgan helped Brian remove his small backpack, which contained the jacket, a water bottle, some energy bars, and a small first aid kit. Using a stalactite that had broken off in the flood as a makeshift splint, Morgan secured it to Brian's leg with the jacket sleeves. "Have you seen anyone else?" Morgan asked as he worked. Brian shook his head. "The current separated everyone. I saw Dax trying to help that older couple, but then another surge came through." He paused. "Your girlfriend, Jessica, right? I think I saw her climb up somewhere on the far side, but it was chaos." Hope surged in Morgan's chest. "We need to find the others." "If they're smart, they'll stay put on high ground," Brian said. "Moving around is dangerous. The water could rise further." As if affirming his point, a fresh surge of water rushed through the chamber, rising another few inches up their perch. "Do you know anything about cave flooding?" Morgan asked. "You're studying geology, right?" Brian nodded grimly. "Enough to know we're in serious trouble. Flash floods in cave systems can last for hours or days, depending on how much rain is falling outside and how the drainage system works. And this cave system is extensive. There could be multiple chambers filling simultaneously." Morgan's stomach clenched. What about rescue? Dax had a radio. If he managed to get a call out before the flood hit, maybe. But cave rescues are complex even in good conditions. With flooding. Brian left the implication hanging. They fell silent, the gravity of their situation sinking in. Morgan's headlamp flickered, reminding him of another problem. "We need to conserve battery power," he said, switching his lamp to its lowest setting. Brian did the same. In the dimmed light, Morgan took inventory of their situation. Between them, they had 1 water bottle, 4 energy bars, a small first aid kit, 2 headlamps with unknown battery life, a multi-tool from Brian's pocket, and their wet clothes. Not much for an extended survival situation. "What about water?" Morgan asked. Brian grimaced. "That's the irony. We're surrounded by water we can't safely drink. Flash floods pick up all kinds of contaminants. Soil, animal waste, chemicals. We'd risk serious illness." Morgan stared at the rushing water. "So we could die of thirst in the middle of a flood?" "Welcome to the cruel logic of survival situations," Brian said with a humorless laugh. "But there might be clean seepage or drips from the ceiling we could collect." Another sound cut through the water's roar, a distant call for help. Morgan jerked his head up, directing his beam toward the sound. "Hello?" he shouted. "We're over here." The voice came again, closer this time. Morgan increased his lamp's brightness and swept it across the chamber. The beam caught a figure moving carefully along the wall about 30 feet away, a woman with dark hair plastered to her head. "Jessica?" Morgan called, heart leaping. "No, it's Laura," came the reply. The middle-aged photographer. "Is that Morgan?" "Yes, with Brian. His leg is broken. Can you make it to us?" "I think so. I've been following the high ground. There are others alive. I heard voices from another chamber." As Laura carefully picked her way toward them, Morgan felt the first stirrings of hope. They weren't all dead. Some had survived the initial flood. Now they just had to stay alive until rescue came, or find their own way out, if either was even possible. By nightfall, or what Morgan assumed was nightfall, time having lost all meaning in the perpetual darkness, they had gathered 5 survivors on their rocky island. Laura had made it safely to them, followed 2 hours later by one of the teenagers from the family of 4, a sullen 16-year-old named Zach who had been separated from his parents and sister. Shortly after, they'd been joined by Jessica's co-worker Allison, who had been a last-minute addition to their trip. There was still no sign of Jessica, Dax, or the others. "We need to take inventory of everything we have," Morgan said, trying to channel calm authority he didn't feel. "And we need to figure out our immediate priorities." Brian, despite his broken leg and pain, nodded in agreement. "Survival basics, shelter, water, food, and signaling for rescue." "Shelter we have, sort of," Laura said, gesturing to their rocky perch. It wasn't comfortable, but it was above the water level, which had stabilized for the past few hours. They pooled their resources in the center of their small refuge. The collective inventory was meager: 3 headlamps, Morgan's, Brian's, and Zach's; 2 small flashlights, Laura's and Allison's; 7 energy bars, 2 chocolate bars, 3 water bottles, 1 empty, a small first aid kit, 2 multi-tools, Laura's camera equipment, Allison's smartphone, useless without signal, various items of clothing, and a space blanket from Zach's pocket. "My dad always makes me carry one," the teenager explained with a shrug when they looked at the metallic blanket. "Says you never know." "Your dad was right," Morgan said. "This could be crucial for conserving body heat." The temperature in the cave wasn't dangerously cold, but it was cool enough, perhaps 60 degrees, that their wet clothes were becoming a concern. Hypothermia would set in eventually if they couldn't dry off and warm up. "What about water?" Allison asked, eyeing their limited supply. "How long will 3 bottles last 5 people?" "Not long enough," Brian said grimly. "We need to find a clean source." Morgan had been thinking about this problem. "I noticed some dripping from stalactites over there," he said, pointing to a corner of their rocky island. "If we set up some kind of collection system." "My camera bag is waterproof," Laura offered. "We could position it under the drips." They arranged the camera bag carefully, and Morgan felt a small victory when the first drops pinged against the plastic. It would take hours to collect any significant amount, but it was something. "What about food?" Zach asked, eyeing the energy bars. "We ration carefully," Morgan decided. 1/3 of a bar per person per day until we know how long we'll be here. "That's barely calories," Allison protested. "The human body can go 3 weeks without food," Brian said. It won't be comfortable, but we can survive much longer without food than without water." Morgan nodded. "Water and warmth are our priorities, and conserving our light sources." They decided on a schedule. Lights would be on for 10 minutes every hour, and one person would keep watch while the others rested. During the dark periods, they would huddle together for warmth under the space blanket. As they settled in for their first night, Morgan took the first watch. In the dim glow of his headlamp set to its lowest setting, he studied their makeshift camp. Laura and Allison had fallen into fitful sleep, while Zach stared blankly at the ceiling. Brian remained awake, his face tight with pain. "How's the leg?" Morgan asked quietly. "Been better," Brian replied with a weak smile. "I'm more worried about infection than the break itself." Morgan nodded. Cave environments were laden with bacteria, and they had only basic first aid supplies. He checked Brian's splint, making sure it was secure but not cutting off circulation. "You're good at this," Brian observed. "The first aid, taking charge. Didn't expect that from—" "A computer nerd?" Morgan finished with a wry smile. Brian had the grace to look embarrassed. "I didn't mean—" "It's fine. I surprise myself sometimes." Morgan stared into the darkness beyond their small circle of light. "My dad was in the Army. He taught me some basics before he died. Never thought I'd need to use them." The conversation lapsed into silence, broken only by the constant rush of water. Morgan's thoughts turned to Jessica. Was she alive? Trapped on another rock island like theirs? Or had the flood claimed her? He pushed the darkest possibilities away. "Jessica's smart," he said aloud, more to himself than Brian. "She does CrossFit. She's a strong swimmer. If anyone could survive this, she could." Brian didn't contradict him. As his watch period ended, Morgan switched off his headlamp to conserve battery. The darkness was absolute, a physical presence pressing against his eyeballs. He'd never experienced such complete absence of light. Even the faintest ambient glow was missing. No stars, no distant streetlights, nothing. In that perfect blackness, Morgan felt a primal fear rising in his chest. Humans weren't meant to be in such darkness. For thousands of generations, his ancestors had at least had firelight, starlight, moonlight. This was wrong on a fundamental level. He closed his eyes, finding it somehow less terrifying than having them open in the void. The darkness behind his eyelids was natural, chosen. He focused on his breathing, on the sounds around him, the water's flow, the occasional drip into Laura's camera bag, the breathing of his companions. "We're alive," he reminded himself. "That's step one. Now we just need to stay that way until rescue comes." "If it comes," a darker voice whispered in his mind. "If anyone even knows where to look." Morgan woke to Zach shaking his shoulder. He'd finally fallen into a fitful sleep during Allison's watch. "Morgan, wake up," the teenager whispered urgently. "Listen." Morgan sat up, wincing at the stiffness in his back from sleeping on rock. He strained his ears and caught it, a faint calling sound, barely audible over the water. "Hello," he shouted, scrambling to his feet. "We're here." The others stirred at his voice. They all listened intently as the distant calling came again. "That's Jessica's voice," Morgan said, heart racing. "I'm sure of it." He fumbled for his headlamp, switching it to full power. The beam cut through the darkness toward the sound, but revealed only more cave formations and rushing water. "Jessica," he called again. "Keep talking. We'll try to find you." The voice grew clearer. "Morgan, is that you? Follow my voice?" Morgan swept his light across the chamber, trying to pinpoint the direction. The cave's acoustics made it difficult. Sounds echoed and bounced off the walls deceptively. "There!" Laura pointed toward a narrow passage they hadn't noticed before, partially obscured by a large stalagmite. Morgan directed his beam that way and caught a flash of movement. A moment later, Jessica's face appeared at the opening, her own headlamp illuminating her features. She looked exhausted, her face scratched and mud-streaked, but wonderfully, impossibly alive. "Jessica!" Morgan's voice cracked with emotion. "There's about 20 feet of water between us," Brian observed, assessing the gap. "Too dangerous to cross with the current." "I have rope," Jessica called. "I found Dax's emergency pack. I can try to throw it to you." She disappeared briefly, then returned with a coiled rope. On her first throw, it fell short, swallowed by the rushing water. On the second attempt, the rope landed just at the edge of their rocky island. Zach lunged for it, securing it before the current could claim it. "Tie it to something solid on your end," Brian called. Jessica nodded and vanished again. When she returned, she gave the rope a tug to show it was secure. "We need to create a handline," Morgan said, recalling a wilderness survival show he'd watched with Jessica months ago. "Something to hold on to while crossing." They tied their end of the rope to a solid stalagmite, pulling it taut. The rope now stretched just above the water level between the 2 points. "I'll go first," Morgan said, surprising himself with his decisiveness. "If I make it, the rest of you can follow, except Brian." He glanced at the injured geologist. "We'll need to figure out how to get you across after." Morgan removed his shoes, securing them around his neck by the laces. The less he carried, the better. He tested the rope's tension one more time, then gripped it firmly and stepped into the rushing water. The current immediately tried to sweep his feet out from under him. The water was shockingly cold, and the force of it far stronger than he'd anticipated. He clung to the rope, muscles straining as he pulled himself forward, inch by painful inch. Halfway across, his grip slipped. For one terrifying moment, he was falling, the current grabbing him, but his other hand maintained its hold. He hung there, feet swept out by the flow, the rope cutting into his palm. With a grunt of effort, he regained his footing and continued. When he finally reached Jessica's side, she pulled him up onto her ledge and into a fierce embrace. "I thought you were dead," she whispered against his neck. "Same," he managed, his arms tightening around her. For a moment, they clung to each other, the magnitude of their survival overwhelming. Jessica pulled back first. "We need to get the others. Dax is here too, and Mrs. Patel from the older couple. Her husband." She shook her head slightly. One by one, they helped the others across. First Zach, then Allison, then Laura. Brian remained on the original island, looking increasingly isolated. "We need a stretcher of some kind," Dax said, assessing the situation. The guide had a nasty gash on his forehead, poorly bandaged with a torn piece of his shirt, but seemed otherwise functional. "What about my camera bag?" Laura suggested. "If we empty it and cut holes for handholds." Using one of the multi-tools, they modified the sturdy bag into a makeshift rescue sling. Morgan and Dax crossed back over, secured Brian into the contraption, and with everyone pulling on the rope, managed to slide him across the water to safety. Once regrouped, they took stock of their expanded resources. Dax's emergency pack contained a more comprehensive first aid kit, water purification tablets, a signal whistle, emergency rations, a more powerful flashlight, batteries, and a detailed map of the cave system. "This is where we are," Dax said, pointing to a section of the map. "The main entrance is completely flooded. That's where the water came in. But there's a secondary exit here, an upper passage that connects to a smaller opening about half a mile away." "Is it above the flood level?" Morgan asked. Dax nodded. "Should be. It's at a much higher elevation. The problem is getting there. We'd need to traverse some flooded sections, and there's this narrow chimney to climb." He indicated a vertical passage on the map. "With Brian's leg, that's going to be challenging," Jessica observed. "Challenging beats impossible," Brian said grimly. "And staying here, waiting for the water to recede, could take days we don't have." They treated their injuries as best they could with the expanded first aid supplies. Mrs. Patel, a retired nurse, properly cleaned and bandaged Dax's head wound and checked Brian's splint, adjusting it for better support. Morgan noticed Jessica wincing as she reached for a water bottle. "You're hurt," he said. She reluctantly showed him her side, where a large bruise was spreading across her ribs. "I got slammed into a rock when the flood first hit. It's just bruised, not broken." Mrs. Patel examined her and confirmed the assessment. Bruised ribs. Painful, but not life-threatening. As they prepared for the journey to the secondary exit, Morgan pulled Jessica aside. "What happened after we got separated?" he asked. Jessica's expression darkened. "The current took me deeper into the cave. I was underwater for, I don't know how long. When I surfaced, I was alone in a small chamber. I climbed onto a ledge and just waited." She swallowed hard. "I could hear screaming at first, then nothing." Morgan squeezed her hand. "Who else have you seen, besides Dax and Mrs. Patel?" "No one," she said quietly. "The others? I don't know." The implication hung between them. 7 people remained unaccounted for, including the rest of Zach's family. The odds weren't good. "We need to move," Dax announced, studying his watch. "According to my calculations, we've been down here about 20 hours. If the rain has stopped outside, the water level might start dropping soon, which gives us a window to reach the chimney before the next chamber floods." They gathered their supplies, helped Brian to his feet. He would hop on one leg with support, and prepared to venture deeper into the cave toward what they hoped was escape. Morgan glanced back at their rocky island, now being slowly consumed by rising water. They were committed now. Forward was the only option. The passage Dax led them through narrowed quickly, forcing them to walk single file. Morgan helped support Brian, who hopped awkwardly on his good leg, his face tight with pain but determination. Jessica took the lead with Dax's powerful flashlight, while Mrs. Patel, Laura Allison, and Zach followed behind. "The water's still rising," Zach observed nervously, glancing back at the passage they'd left. The flood had indeed crept higher, now lapping at the entrance to their new route. "All the more reason to keep moving," Dax said grimly. "This passage climbs gradually. We should stay ahead of the water if we maintain pace." The journey was slow and treacherous. The cave floor was slick with mud and uneven with rock formations. Twice Morgan nearly lost his footing while supporting Brian's weight. His muscles burned with exertion, and hunger gnawed at his stomach. They'd rationed only a small portion of their food since regrouping. An hour into their trek, they reached a section where the passage ceiling dipped dramatically, forcing them to crouch and eventually crawl through a tight squeeze. "Brian can't do this," Morgan realized, looking at the narrow opening. "I can try," Brian insisted, but the pain in his eyes betrayed him. Dax studied the map. "There's an alternate route, but it's longer and might have standing water." "I'll go with Brian," Morgan volunteered. "The rest of you take the shorter path. We'll meet at the junction marked here." He pointed to the map. Jessica shook her head firmly. "I'm not getting separated again. I'll go with you and Brian." After a brief debate, they split into 2 groups. Morgan, Jessica, and Brian would take the longer route, while Dax would lead the others through the squeeze. They agreed to wait for each other at the junction, no matter what. The alternate path descended slightly before curving around, which worried Morgan. Any descent meant potential flooding. His concern proved valid when they encountered ankle-deep water 30 minutes later. "We need to move faster," Jessica urged, eyeing the water level. Brian was flagging, his face pale and sweaty from the effort of hopping and the constant pain. "I just need a minute," he gasped as they reached a slightly wider section of tunnel. Morgan helped him sit on a rock ledge above the water. "Take a few deep breaths. We'll check the map." Jessica unfolded Dax's map, angling her headlamp to illuminate it. "We're here, I think," she said, pointing. "The junction should be about 200 meters ahead." Morgan nodded, studying the route. Something caught his eye, a small notation near their position. "What's this symbol?" Jessica squinted. "Looks like a water droplet, maybe a spring or water source." Brian leaned over to look. "That's the standard notation for a sump, a passage that's completely underwater." Morgan's heart sank. "So this route might be flooded ahead?" "Possibly," Brian admitted. "But these maps show permanent features. Flash flooding is different. It affects areas that are normally dry." They rested for 5 minutes, sharing a few sips of water and a small piece of energy bar. Brian's condition worried Morgan. The geology student was showing signs of shock, his skin clammy and his responses increasingly sluggish. "We need to keep him warm and get him out of here," Jessica whispered to Morgan. "He needs a hospital." They continued forward, the water now reaching mid-calf. The passage narrowed again, forcing them to turn sideways in some sections. Brian was barely supporting any weight on his good leg now, leaning heavily on Morgan. Then they hit the sump, a section where the passage dipped and was completely submerged. "Damn it," Morgan muttered, shining his light into the water. "Can you see how far it goes?" Jessica crouched, peering into the murky water. "I can't tell. The passage curves." "We can't go back," Brian said weakly. "The water behind us is still rising." Morgan made a quick decision. "I'll go through first to check. If it's passable, I'll come back for you." "No," Jessica protested. "We're not separating." "We don't have a choice," Morgan insisted. "Brian can't hold his breath and swim with that leg. We need to know if there's air on the other side." Before she could argue further, Morgan took a deep breath and plunged into the water. The cold shocked his system as he pulled himself forward along the rock ceiling. The passage curved slightly to the right, and for a terrifying moment he couldn't see an end to the submerged section. His lungs began to burn. Just as panic started to set in, his hand broke the surface. He pushed forward and emerged into an air pocket, gasping. The tunnel continued beyond, partially flooded, but with enough headroom to breathe. He took a moment to catch his breath, then ducked back under, retracing his path to Jessica and Brian. "There's air on the other side," he reported when he surfaced. "The submerged section is about 20 feet long. We can make it, but we'll need to help Brian." They devised a plan. Morgan would go first again, then Jessica would help Brian take a deep breath and push him into the water. Morgan would pull him from the other side, while Jessica guided from behind. "I'm not sure I can do this," Brian admitted, fear evident in his voice. "You can," Morgan assured him. 20 seconds underwater, that's all. Count it in your head." The plan worked, barely. Brian emerged on the other side, coughing and sputtering, having swallowed water, but alive. Jessica followed moments later. They continued through the partially flooded tunnel, the water now waist-deep, but the ceiling high enough to keep their heads dry. After another 15 minutes of slow progress, they saw light ahead, headlamps from the other group waiting at the junction. "We were getting worried," Dax said as they approached. "What happened?" "Sump," Morgan explained tersely, helping Brian sit on a dry ledge. "He's not doing well." Mrs. Patel immediately checked Brian's vital signs. "His pulse is rapid and weak. We need to warm him up and get some sugar into his system." They shared the last of their chocolate bars, the sugar providing a small but noticeable boost to everyone's energy. Dax studied the map again. "The chimney is ahead," he said. "Once we climb that, we should be in passages well above the flood level. Then it's about half a mile to the secondary exit." "How tall is this chimney?" Jessica asked. "About 40 feet, Dax replied. "Normally, I'd never bring tourists this way. It requires technical climbing skills, but it's our only option now." Morgan looked at Brian, knowing what everyone was thinking, but no one wanted to say. How would they get him up a 40-foot vertical shaft? "We'll use the rope," Morgan said finally. "Make a harness for him. Those of us who make it up first can pull while others guide from below." The plan was risky, but no one had a better suggestion. They continued forward, the passage now blessedly dry as it began to slope upward. After another 30 minutes, they reached the base of the chimney, a narrow vertical shaft disappearing into darkness above. Dax examined the rock face. "There are enough handholds. I'll go first with the rope, anchor it at the top, then you can use it to help climb." The guide was more skilled than Morgan had realized. Despite his head injury, Dax scaled the chimney with impressive speed, securing the rope to a sturdy formation at the top. One by one, they followed. First Zach, who climbed with the natural agility of youth, then Laura and Allison, struggling but determined. Mrs. Patel surprised them all with her competence. "I was a mountaineer in my younger days," she explained with a sad smile. "Raj and I both were. He would have managed this easily." When only Morgan, Jessica, and Brian remained at the bottom, they fashioned a harness for Brian using pieces of Laura's camera bag and their belts. The plan was for Jessica to climb next, then help pull from above, while Morgan guided Brian from below. "You can do this," Morgan told Brian as they secured the makeshift harness. Brian nodded weakly. "If I don't make it—" "Don't," Morgan cut him off. "We're all getting out. Together." Jessica climbed next, moving carefully but confidently. When she reached the top, they began the arduous process of lifting Brian. Morgan supported him from below as the others pulled from above. Brian cried out in pain several times as his broken leg bumped against the rock wall, but they continued steadily. The effort was exhausting. Morgan's arms trembled with fatigue as he pushed upward, helping to take some of Brian's weight off the rope. Halfway up, Brian passed out from the pain, his body going limp. "Keep pulling," Morgan shouted up. "He's unconscious." With renewed urgency, the group above heaved on the rope. Inch by painful inch, they raised Brian's limp form. When they finally pulled him over the edge at the top, Morgan allowed himself a moment of relief before beginning his own climb. His muscles screamed in protest. 2 days of minimal food, constant stress, and physical exertion had depleted his reserves. Halfway up, his hand slipped from a hold, and he swung out from the wall, hanging by one hand and the rope. "Morgan!" Jessica's panicked voice echoed down. He gritted his teeth and found another handhold, continuing upward. When he finally reached the top, Jessica and Dax pulled him over the edge. He lay on his back, gasping for breath, staring up at the limestone ceiling. "We made it," he panted. "Not yet," Dax said, helping him sit up. "But we're close. The secondary exit should be about half a mile ahead and all on level ground." Brian had regained consciousness and was being tended to by Mrs. Patel. His face was ashen, but he managed a weak smile at Morgan. "Thanks," he whispered. "You could have left me." Morgan shook his head. "Not an option." They rested for 20 minutes, sharing the last of their water and food. The passage they were in now was larger, with a high ceiling and evidence of previous visitors, old footprints in the dust and even some faded initials carved into a wall. "People have been here before," Zach observed. "Local cavers know about this entrance," Dax explained. "It's not on the tourist route because it's too challenging, but experienced spelunkers use it sometimes." "Chutti." The knowledge that they were following a path others had traveled brought a small measure of comfort. As they prepared to make the final leg of their journey, Morgan felt a cautious hope beginning to bloom. They had overcome the worst obstacles. The secondary exit was within reach. But as they would soon discover, the cave had one final challenge in store for them. They moved through the upper passage with renewed energy, buoyed by the prospect of escape. The terrain was easier here, mostly level with fewer obstacles. Even Brian seemed to have found a second wind, hopping along with Morgan and Jessica's support. "How much further?" Laura asked, her voice echoing slightly in the wider tunnel. Dax consulted the map. "Should be just around this bend, then through a chamber called the attic, and we'll see daylight." As they rounded the bend, their headlamps illuminated a sight that stopped them cold. A massive pile of freshly fallen rock completely blocking the passage. "No," Allison whispered. "No, no, no." Dax approached the collapse cautiously, examining the jagged stones. "This is recent. Must have happened during the earthquake that triggered the flash flood." "Earthquake?" Morgan asked. "I thought it was just a storm." "Both, apparently," Dax said grimly. "I felt the tremors just before the water hit. Small quake, but enough to destabilize sections of the cave." Jessica ran her hand along the wall near the collapse. "Is it safe? Could more come down?" "Hard to say," Dax admitted. "But we can't go back." They stood in silence, staring at the barrier between them and freedom. After everything they'd endured, the flood, the treacherous journey, the chimney climb, To be stopped now seemed cruelly unfair. "Can we dig through it?" Zach asked, the first to break the stunned silence. Dax studied the collapse. "Maybe. Some of these rocks look manageable, but we need to be extremely careful. Shift the wrong one, and we could trigger another collapse." They organized into teams. Dax, Morgan, and Jessica would carefully remove rocks, passing them back to Laura, Allison, and Zach, who would stack them safely aside. Mrs. Patel would stay with Brian, monitoring his condition. The work was painstaking and exhausting. Each rock had to be tested before removal to ensure it wasn't supporting others. Their progress was measured in inches, not feet. After 2 hours of labor, they had cleared only a small section of the blockage. "There's air coming through," Jessica noticed, placing her hand near the small opening they'd created. "That means there's a path to the outside." The discovery gave them renewed determination. They continued working, ignoring their aching muscles and growing thirst. Their water was gone now, and dehydration was becoming a serious concern. 3 hours into the effort, they had created a hole large enough for someone to peer through. Zach, being the smallest, carefully positioned himself to look. "I can see more passage," he reported. "And I think, yes, there's a faint light at the end. Daylight." The news energized the group. They worked with fresh vigor, carefully expanding the opening. Eventually, it grew large enough that they thought Zach might be able to squeeze through. "If you can get out," Dax told him, "find help. Tell them exactly where we are." Zach nodded solemnly. "I will. I promise." The teenager removed his small backpack and wriggled headfirst into the opening. For a tense moment, he seemed stuck, but then, with a final push, he slipped through to the other side. "I'm through," his muffled voice called back. "The passage is clear ahead. I can definitely see daylight." "Go," Dax called. "Get help." They heard Zach's footsteps receding, then silence. The waiting began. "How long do you think before help arrives?" Allison asked. Dax considered. "Depends on how far Zach has to go to find people. Could be hours." "Shti?" They took turns resting while continuing to enlarge the opening. Morgan worked until his hands were raw and bleeding, then forced himself to take a break. He sat beside Brian, who had been watching their efforts through half-lidded eyes. "How are you holding up?" Morgan asked. "Been better," Brian replied with a weak attempt at humor. "The leg's infected, I think. Feels hot." Morgan placed a hand on Brian's forehead. "You're burning up." Mrs. Patel confirmed the fever. "We've used the last of the antibiotics from the first aid kit. He needs medical attention soon." Morgan nodded grimly and returned to the rock pile, working with renewed urgency. Another hour passed, and they had enlarged the opening enough that Laura, the next smallest, thought she might fit through. "I should try," she said. "If I can get out too, that's one more person safe." The others agreed. Laura removed her jacket and camera bag, passing them through first, then began the difficult process of squeezing through the narrow gap. Unlike Zach, she struggled more, her shoulders barely fitting. "I'm stuck," she gasped after a moment of trying. "Exhale completely," Mrs. Patel advised. "Make yourself as small as possible." Laura tried again, exhaling fully, and with a painful-looking contortion, managed to slip through. "I'm out," she called back. "I'll follow Zach and make sure help is coming." With two of their group now safely through, they continued working to enlarge the hole. Morgan's thoughts turned to Jessica, who had been working tirelessly beside him. Her face was streaked with dirt and sweat, her usually neat hair a tangled mess, but to Morgan she had never looked more beautiful, her determination and strength shining through the grime. "When we get out of here," he said quietly as they worked side by side, "I have something important to ask you." Jessica paused, looking at him curiously. "You're picking now for this conversation?" Morgan managed a tired smile. "Facing death gives you perspective. I don't want to waste any more time." Before Jessica could respond, a new sound reached them. Voices from the other side of the rock pile. Unfamiliar voices. "Hello? "Is anyone in there?" a man's voice called. "Yes," Dax shouted back. "8 of us, one with a broken leg and infection." "Rescue team from Red Rock County," the voice replied. "Zach and Laura found a ranger station. We're going to get you out." A cheer went up from the group. After 48 hours trapped underground, rescue was finally at hand. The professional team worked quickly, using proper equipment to safely remove rocks and shore up the opening. Within an hour, they had created a passage large enough for everyone to crawl through safely. They sent a medic through first to assess Brian's condition. After administering emergency treatment, they carefully moved him through the opening on a proper stretcher. One by one, the others followed. Mrs. Patel, then Allison, then Dax. Jessica went next, turning to give Morgan a quick kiss before she crawled through. "Whatever you want to ask me," she said, "the answer is yes." Morgan was the last to leave their underground prison. As he emerged on the other side, blinking in the painful brightness of actual daylight, he felt an overwhelming surge of emotion. The sky above was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen, a clear blue expanse that seemed impossibly vast after the confines of the cave. Rescue workers helped him to his feet and guided him toward the exit. Ahead, he could see Jessica waiting for him, silhouetted against the mouth of the cave. They had survived. Against all odds, they had found their way back to the light. The transition back to the world above ground was jarring. After the perpetual darkness of the cave, even the subdued light of a cloudy afternoon felt blinding. Morgan squinted as paramedics guided him to one of several ambulances parked on a muddy Forest Service road. The scene was controlled chaos, rescue workers in bright vests moving purposefully, radios crackling with updates, helicopter rotors thumping somewhere nearby. Morgan caught glimpses of his fellow survivors being attended to. Brian was already on a stretcher being loaded into a medevac helicopter. Mrs. Patel sat wrapped in a silver thermal blanket, staring vacantly into the distance. Dax was speaking with a group of officials, pointing occasionally toward the cave entrance. A paramedic directed Morgan to sit on the edge of an ambulance and began checking his vitals. "Any trouble breathing? Chest pain? Dizziness?" she asked efficiently. "Just exhausted," Morgan replied, his eyes searching for Jessica. He spotted her 20 yards away, receiving similar treatment from another paramedic. Their eyes met briefly, and she gave him a tired smile that made his heart swell. The paramedic shined a light in his eyes, checking pupil response. "You're dehydrated and showing signs of mild hypothermia. We're going to start an IV and get you to the hospital for observation." Morgan nodded absently, still processing the reality of their rescue. It felt dreamlike, surreal after the intense focus on survival that had consumed him for the past 2 days. A police officer approached with a notepad. "Sir, I know you've been through a lot, but we need some information about the others who were in your tour group. We have search teams looking for survivors." The question jolted Morgan back to a harsh reality. Not everyone had made it out with them. Zach's parents and sister, the other geology student, the older man who had been with Mrs. Patel. "I don't know," he admitted. "We got separated when the flood first hit. We never saw the others after that." The officer nodded grimly. "We've recovered 3 bodies so far, still searching for the others." The news hit Morgan like a physical blow. Even though he had suspected as much, hearing it confirmed made it real in a way his mind had been protecting him from. "Does Zach know?" he asked, glancing toward the teenager who sat alone on a rock some distance away, a blanket around his shoulders. "About his family? Not yet. We're waiting for a crisis counselor." Morgan felt a surge of anger at the cruelty of it all, that this kid who had shown such courage would now face the worst news imaginable. He remembered how Zach had squeezed through the collapse first, how he had found help and saved them all. "I want to be there when he's told," Morgan said firmly. "He shouldn't hear it from strangers." The officer seemed about to object, then nodded. "I'll let the counselor know when they arrive." After receiving IV fluids and being cleared for immediate transport, Morgan was allowed to join Jessica in the back of an ambulance. She reached for his hand as soon as he sat beside her. "Brian's going to make it," she said. "They think they can save his leg, too." Morgan squeezed her hand. "Good. That's good." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of their experience settling around them like a heavy cloak. "3 didn't make it," Morgan finally said quietly. "They're still looking for the others." Jessica closed her eyes briefly. "Zach's family?" "I don't know who specifically. They haven't told him yet." The ambulance began moving, jostling them slightly as it navigated the rough road. Through the small rear windows, Morgan watched the cave entrance recede, an unremarkable opening in the hillside that had nearly become their tomb. "What were you going to ask me?" Jessica said suddenly. "In the cave, you said you had something important to ask." Morgan looked at her, really looked at her. Her face was gaunt from dehydration and hunger, her hair matted with mud, cuts and bruises marking her skin. She had never been more beautiful to him. "I was going to ask you to marry me," he said simply. A tear slid down her dirt-streaked cheek. "Pretty sure I already said yes." "You did," he agreed, managing a small smile. "But I want to do it properly when we're not half dead in an ambulance." She leaned her head against his shoulder. "I almost lost you in there." "But you didn't," he reminded her. "We found each other." At the regional hospital, they were separated for treatment. Morgan underwent a battery of tests, blood work, X-rays of his injured shoulder, treatment for cuts and abrasions. The doctors seemed impressed by their relatively good condition given the circumstances. "You did everything right," one doctor told him. "Rationing water and food, finding high ground, working together. Most people wouldn't have been so resourceful." Morgan didn't feel resourceful. He felt lucky and guilty. Why had he survived when others hadn't? The question haunted him as he lay in the hospital bed, staring at the ceiling. Late that evening, after being cleared by the doctors, Morgan was allowed to visit Jessica in her room. She was asleep when he entered, an IV still attached to her arm. He sat quietly beside her bed, watching the steady rise and fall of her chest, profoundly grateful for each breath. A soft knock at the door interrupted his vigil. A hospital social worker stood there with Zach beside her, the teenager's face a mask of shock. "He asked to see you," the social worker explained softly. Morgan stood and opened his arms. Zach walked into them stiffly, like a sleepwalker. For a moment he stood rigid in Morgan's embrace, then collapsed against him, his body racked with silent sobs. "My mom and dad," he choked out. "And Emma. They found them." Morgan held him tightly, his own tears flowing freely now. No words seemed adequate, so he offered none, just the solid presence of someone who had shared the darkness with him. Eventually, Zach pulled back, wiping roughly at his eyes. "They said I have to go stay with my aunt in Denver. I don't even know her that well." "We'll stay in touch," Morgan promised. "You're not alone in this." The teenager nodded, not looking convinced. The social worker gently led him away, leaving Morgan standing in the doorway, feeling hollowed out. When he turned back, Jessica was awake, tears streaming silently down her face. She had heard everything. "His whole family," she whispered. "God, Morgan." He returned to her side, taking her hand. "I know." They sat together in silence, bearing witness to a grief they could feel but not fully share. Outside the window, night had fallen, the darkness a reminder of what they had escaped and what others had not. "What happens now?" Jessica asked eventually. Morgan considered the question. "What did happen after you crawled back from the edge of death? How did you return to normal life carrying the weight of survival when others had perished?" "I don't know," he admitted. "But we figure it out together." She nodded, squeezing his hand. Together. In that quiet hospital room, with the beep of monitors and the distant sounds of the medical staff going about their duties, Morgan made a silent promise. To himself, to Jessica, to Zach, and to those who hadn't made it out of the darkness. He would not waste the life he had been granted. He would live it fully, purposefully, gratefully. It was the only tribute he could offer to those who no longer could. 3 months after the cave disaster, Morgan stood at the edge of the memorial garden that had been established near the entrance to Red Rock Canyon. 7 small stone markers formed a semicircle around a central plaque that told the story of the flash flood and honored those who had lost their lives. The autumn air was crisp, leaves turning gold and red on the trees surrounding the memorial. Morgan placed a small stone on each marker, a tradition he had started on his first visit back, a month after the rescue. Jessica stood a respectful distance away, giving him the space he needed for this ritual. They had driven 5 hours from Philadelphia for this visit, part of a journey that had become important to both of them. After placing the last stone, Morgan walked to the central plaque and ran his fingers over the engraved names: Raj Patel, Emma Chen, Michael Chen, Lisa Chen, Thomas Wilson, Catherine Rodriguez, Mark Ellison. 7 lives ended in darkness. 7 families shattered. Morgan had attended the funerals for Zach's family, standing at the back of the church as 3 coffins were laid to rest. The boy had spotted him and Jessica, had walked over with wooden steps to thank them for coming. His aunt, a kind-faced woman with Lisa Chen's eyes, had embraced them both with tears. "You brought him out," she had whispered. "You saved my nephew. Thank you." The gratitude had felt wrong, misplaced. Morgan hadn't saved Zach. If anything, Zach had saved them all by being brave enough to squeeze through the collapse first. A hand touched his shoulder, bringing him back to the present. Jessica stood beside him now, her engagement ring catching the autumn sunlight. "Brian's here," she said softly. Morgan turned to see the geology student approaching slowly, walking with a cane, but otherwise moving well. His recovery had been remarkable. Multiple surgeries had saved his leg, though doctors said he would always walk with a slight limp. "Didn't expect to see you 2 here today," Brian said as he reached them, extending his hand to Morgan. Morgan shook it firmly. "We try to come back every month. Feels important somehow." Brian nodded, understanding. "First time I've been able to make the trip myself. Still doing physical therapy 3 times a week." "How's the research going?" Jessica asked. After recovering, Brian had redirected his academic focus, now studying cave hydrology and flash flood prediction systems. The disaster had changed the course of his life in more ways than one. "Making progress," he said. "The university gave me a special grant. They're calling it the Red Rock Research Initiative." He glanced at the memorial, trying to make sure this doesn't happen again. They stood in silence for a moment, united by their shared experience in a way few others could understand. "Have you heard from the others?" Brian asked eventually. "Mrs. Patel moved to Colorado to be closer to her daughter," Jessica replied. "Laura's photos from the cave were published in National Geographic. Did you see them? And Allison." She hesitated. "Allison's still having a hard time. PTSD. She can't be in small spaces anymore." Morgan had stayed in touch with most of their fellow survivors. They had formed a bond that transcended ordinary friendship, a connection forged in darkness and fear that couldn't be explained to outsiders. "And Zach?" Brian asked. "Starting college next fall," Morgan said with a hint of pride. "Environmental science at Colorado State. We talk every week." After the disaster, Morgan and Jessica had become something like unofficial guardians to the teenager. They'd helped him apply for colleges, celebrated his high school graduation, and made sure he knew he wasn't alone. "He's doing better than any of us could have expected," Jessica added. "Kids are resilient." As they talked, Morgan noticed a family approaching the memorial, a young couple with 2 small children. They moved respectfully around the markers, the father explaining something in hushed tones to the children. Tourists, probably, coming to see the site of the tragedy that had made national news. The cave itself had been closed indefinitely after the disaster. Geologists had determined that the earthquake had destabilized significant portions of the system, making it too dangerous for visitors. The tour company had gone bankrupt from the lawsuits. "I should head back," Brian said, glancing at his watch. "Long drive to Denver." They exchanged contact information and promises to stay in touch. Then Brian limped back to his car, leaving Morgan and Jessica alone at the memorial once more. "Ready?" Jessica asked after a moment. Morgan nodded. There was one more stop they needed to make. They drove 30 minutes to a small ranger station on the other side of the canyon lands. The ranger on duty recognized them immediately. He had been part of the rescue operation. "Mr. Chen, Ms. Winters, good to see you both. He's expecting you." They followed a narrow trail behind the station that led to a small cabin overlooking the canyon. Dax stood on the porch, watching their approach. After the disaster, he had left guiding to become a search and rescue coordinator for the Park Service. "Right on time," he said, greeting them with firm handshakes. "Everything's ready." Inside the cabin, maps and equipment were spread across a large table. Dax had been helping them plan something important, something that had taken months of preparation. "I've marked the safest routes," he explained, pointing to a topographical map. "This time of year, you shouldn't have any weather concerns, but I've noted emergency shelters just in case." Morgan studied the route, a 5-day hike through the canyon lands, ending at a vista point that overlooked the entire region. It would be challenging but not technical, requiring basic wilderness skills, but nothing extreme. "And you're sure we're ready for this?" Jessica asked. Dax nodded. "You've both completed the wilderness first aid course, navigation training, and the overnight trials. You're as prepared as anyone could be." After their rescue, Morgan and Jessica had made a decision. They would not let fear dictate their lives. Instead of avoiding the outdoors, they had embraced it, systematically learning the skills they had lacked in the cave. What had begun as a form of therapy had evolved into a passion. "We start tomorrow, then," Morgan said, tracing the route with his finger. They spent another hour reviewing details with Dax before heading to their hotel. That evening, as they packed their carefully selected gear, Morgan found himself thinking about how much had changed. The software developer who had hesitated at the cave entrance was gone. In his place stood someone different, someone who had faced darkness and survived, who had learned to trust himself and others in ways he never imagined. "Second thoughts?" Jessica asked, noticing his contemplative mood. Morgan shook his head. "Just thinking about who I was before the cave." "And who are you now?" she asked, setting down the water filter she'd been checking. He considered the question. "Someone who knows that the worst can happen, and that we can survive it anyway." Jessica crossed the room and wrapped her arms around him. "That's why we're doing this, isn't it? To prove it to ourselves." "Partly," he agreed, "but also because life's too short not to see what's out there." That night, Morgan dreamed of the cave, not the flood or the terror, but the moment they had emerged into daylight. In his dream, the sky stretched infinitely above them, a canvas of blue that promised freedom. The next morning they set out at dawn, their packs containing everything they would need for 5 days in the wilderness. The trail led them along the rim of the canyon, offering spectacular views of the landscape that had nearly claimed their lives. By midday, they had hiked 6 miles, moving at a steady pace through terrain that would have intimidated them before. They stopped for lunch on a rocky outcropping, the canyon spread before them like a painting. "Look," Jessica said, pointing to a distant formation. "You can see the secondary entrance from here." Morgan followed her gesture to a small dark spot on the canyon wall, the opening through which they had eventually escaped. From this distance, it looked insignificant, just another shadow on the vast landscape. "Hard to believe that's where we came out," he said. "Hard to believe any of it sometimes," she agreed. "If you had told me a year ago that I'd be voluntarily spending 5 days in the wilderness." Morgan smiled. "If you had told me a year ago that I'd know how to start a fire without matches or navigate by the stars." They laughed together, the sound carrying across the canyon. It felt good to laugh about it now, to find joy on the other side of trauma. As they continued their journey, Morgan thought about the others who had been in the cave, those who had survived, and those who hadn't. He carried them with him, their stories intertwined with his own. In a strange way, he carried the cave itself within him, not as a place of fear anymore, but as the crucible that had revealed what he was capable of. That night, as they made camp under a canopy of stars, Morgan held Jessica close. Tomorrow they would continue deeper into the wilderness, facing whatever challenges came their way. And they would do it together, step by step, finding their way by the light they carried within themselves. The darkness had taught them many things, but perhaps the most important was this. No matter how deep the cave, how complete the darkness, there was always a path back to light. You just had to be brave enough to find it.